on our roads and highway synchronization user interface. And to be clear, this isn't specific to roads and highways despite its name. This is any Esri layer that's been exposed to the world, either through, ArcGIS Online or through your enterprise ArcGIS server license. I don't know, maybe even Portal. I'm not sure exactly how that works for you Minnesota folks, but I assume there's still REST endpoints somewhere out there. And so that's what we're talking about today, is what exactly that looks like, what it can do, etc. So we started this process quite a while ago now. The whole point was pretty much at this point, a lot of people have either exposed ArcGIS layers that have useful information, or can probably get ArcGIS layers exposed for them that again have useful information. The idea here is that Jackalope doesn't necessarily own all the data. Some data, like for example, functional class, might be something that your LRS and your GIS people maintain within ArcGIS, and you might manually update that every once in a while in Jackalope. But wouldn't it be better if Jackalope could say, oh, actually, functional class is not something we own, that's something ArcGIS owns, and then we just pull that over when it changes and updates the Jackalope system appropriately. And that was the whole idea between the roads and highways synchronization user interface, is to basically make sure there's only one version of the truth, not two places where functional classes are maintained, or route names are maintained, or speed limits are maintained. Just have a single point where that's maintained. Maybe it's, it's in your LRS, and then we pull that information down into Jackalope and it's updated automatically. And the history is here, a certain subset of the states that were interested in this started meeting and started doing design discussions, and there were quite a few technical hiccups along the way, but we're finally at the point where we have a useful product that can do what we need to do. Let me just give you an overview of how this actually works. Jackalope Web Services, JWS, is actually responsible for all the heavy lifting here. And with regards to getting information from layers, it has to happen a lot like if you're used to database lingo. It kind of has to happen from a primary key, foreign key exchange, where we first look up a site and get its coordinates, and then using those coordinates, we can query any number of other layers and get the useful information. So for example, let's say you have a site ID in Jackalope, and you also have a layer in roads and highways that has site ID in it. We first query site, 1111 in roads and highways and determine that 1111 is at this particular coordinate. Once we have that coordinate, we can then go to all your other layers, like the functional class layer, and say, oh, what functional class is coordinate 111, or that in, and we can pull down that functional class. And we can do that at all the ArcGIS feature shapes. So we can do that, we can query a point, we can query a polyline, we can query an area. So it doesn't really matter as long as things match up. So that's how the site exchange works. We first go and get the coordinates of all the primary keys, and then we use those primary keys on each of the other layers that you define. Does that make sense? All right, I need to get my comments up. Give me 1 second.
I'll check for you, Joe. I'll let you know so you don't have to lose your place.
All right. I just wanted to have it up so I could, on my other screen, just so I could scroll to it naturally. All right. So with regards to development phases, like I said, this has been kind of a long process, and we're finally done with phase 1 here, which is we will synchronize using the rules that I just said from some REST endpoints plural, in a staged environment. What that means is that we will go and get all the information and we'll present that to you, but then you've got to actually go in and say, okay, that's cool, okay, that's not. Phase 2 will enable what we call auto synchronization. So there are probably some attributes in roads and highways that probably are pretty important, and if they change, it's going to potentially mess with things. Like, so let's say a whole route or something gets its number of lanes changed. Well, if you just automatically accept that in Jackalope, you might mess with some existing data or who knows what. So there's certain probably benign attribute changes that you don't really care about, and you might just say, well, let's just go ahead and automatically synchronize those with the Jackalope. We don't care. But there's some that probably aren't particularly benign, and those you want to stage like we're doing now in phase 1. So that's what auto sync is. And then synchronization by change date is, okay, give me all the changes since January 1st, 2020. And then it'll go out and it'll be able to query and get all those changes since then. And then finally in phase 2 will be syncing by network date. Some of your ArcGIS endpoints support the idea of, I forgot the name of it now. What's the name of the thing where you can roll back your network to a certain date? It's not timeline, it's something else. I can't remember. But anyway, it's that thing. So we could go and say, well, what did the network look like on January 1st, 2020? And you could get a snapshot of that and see, oh, here's the changes that happened. So that's part of phase 2. Phase 3 is a bidirectional synchronization. So currently you can have attributes owned by Jackalope. You can have attributes owned by roads and highways. There'd be a third category, which is attributes owned by Jackalope, and then we want to push that into roads and highways. So, for example, you might, I don't know, there might be some attributes in Jackalope that roads and highways normally doesn't really know anything about. But you want to go ahead and just push those into some layer in roads and highways and have the direction or have the synchronization go the other way. That's phase 3. And this, by the way, is a question mark. We've talked about that, and maybe that would be interesting, but I don't know that we've heard anyone say, yes, we must have this. Although if we do our mobile app like we talked about yesterday, we need the bidirectional synchronization regardless. So phase 4 is the synchronization of annual data elements. So typically what we call our RDI, or remote database interface, consists of 2 directions. One, we suck site information from the external database into Jackalope. And 2, generally annually, we take the site statistics, so like the site ADTs, the K-factor, D-factors, whatever, and we push those into the external database. So phase 4 is that piece. And this is another question mark. We don't know if people are really interested in that or not. It's been brought up a few times, but phase 3 and 4 are question marks. We don't know if they need to happen, but that's where we are. Demo. Hey. Come on. All right. So we're going to be using Nevada. With regards to our guinea pigs, thank you, Chris in Nevada. Nevada was really good. We went from testing in my kind of test Minnesota database, and we were able to get a lot of the stuff we needed to get done. And then we went to Nevada, and Nevada has a much higher version of ArcGIS Server installed, and there's a lot more interesting things that happened. And so, good Lord, I was just connected to Nevada. Why are you gonna do this to me, man? So, what was I just saying? I got blocked by my Nevada twisting thing here. I was just connected. Come on.
Version of Arc Server.
Pardon me? Say it again?
You were talking about versions of Arc Server.
You're asking me which versions are which?
No, she was keeping you on track. You were saying.
Thank you for being the brain that I apparently don't have. Thank you. Yes, versions of Arc Server. And it's more complicated than that. Actually, Christy, you sort of entered this realm when we were talking about something earlier, where we were talking about, oh yeah, because of this compatibility with this, and this is a little bit off from that. You know, map server is different from our feature server, and there's weird things going on. Yeah, we know we had that same issue when it went from you guys to Nevada. There's differences when you're talking about the different servers, and even independently of the version of the server, layers and feature classes can be configured differently. Like when we were first doing Minnesota, you guys don't have any timestamps on any of your layers, and so we're scratching our heads. You know, how do we do this whole? Well, let's find out everything that's changed since the last time we looked. Well, that's going to be impossible in Minnesota, I think. And then when we got to Nevada, and we'd also discovered, oh yeah, there are timestamps. And I don't know if that's an ArcGIS version thing or if it's
it might be up to each individual state and what they decide to put into a public set of data for people to consume.
Yeah, I think you might be right. That's probably more accurate than it's just an ArcGIS thing. It's an attribute. If you go into the layer definitions or the feature class definitions, you can actually see whether or not timestamping is enabled. And in all the Minnesota layers I checked, it was not enabled. And then the Nevada, and not 100% of the Nevada layers. Some of the Nevada layers, it was enabled. So, you know, that just means probably, you know, that some of the more sophisticated things, like saying, give me all the changes since this time, are only going to be possible for either a subset of the layers, or we need to ask the GIS folk whether they could just, you know, enable it on everything. And that might be harder. That may be easier said than done, I'm not sure. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the metadata that we're going to set up. And that's all in our metadata table. It used to be called site metadata. We now have metadata for all 4 of our objects that are site splittable or intersection splittable or sections, you know. So you know how sites have the ability to have history over time. There's actually 4 things that have that, and the metadata is now for all 4 of those. I'm trying to remember. Hold on. What's Nevada's primary key? Is it site ID? I think it's site. Yes, site ID. And by the way, this is not intended to be training. This is just intended to be, let's show you what we can do. And when it actually comes time to setting this up, we would want to be involved in that process because it's pretty complex. So the first thing you would do is you would set up your primary key. And this is that unique identifier that you got in your state that you could then query the roads and highways database and, you know, get the coordinates for that point. And again, it doesn't have to be roads and highways. In fact, in Nevada, it's not roads and highways. Nevada has a system called Trina that is not under the roads and highways umbrella, as I understand it. And we're retrieving the points from that, and then we're using those points against roads and highways layers to consume the actual attributes that we're interested in. So when you go down here, for most columns, it's going to be the column source can either be Jackalope or roads and highways. So if it's Jackalope, you don't see anything else here. We're done. If it's roads and highways, then you have a choice. Is the column that we are editing, this metadata column, is it a primary key or basically a foreign key, something we're going to get from an ArcGIS layer? In this case, we're setting up the primary key. As part of setup, we will set up 1 or more base URLs. There are 2 base URLs in Nevada that expose all the layers that are available in the state. They have one that is an ArcGIS server, and then they have the RH, which I assume stands for Roads and Highways GIS server. So they're 2 distinct servers, and you have access to both of those. And that's part of setup that we'll set up for you. So in this particular case, we are not going against the roads and highways, right? The Trina is not a roads and highways application. So it's going against their generic ArcGIS endpoint. The layer is, that this dialog, excuse me, this dropdown is filled out automatically when you select the base URL. And it contains, man, there's a lot of layers. It contains every layer that's available at that endpoint. There's a gajillion of them. In this case, we know it's the Trina stations because Drew and Susie and Chris and everybody got together and figured that out. And then within that particular layer, here are the actual columns. And we need to basically match name in the Trina stations layer at that one endpoint to road name 1 of Jackalope. So when those two match, we know we've got a match, and we know that we can pull that coordinate down, and then we can use that coordinate to query all of our foreign keys. Does that make sense? I see comments, but it looks like it's related to.
Yes, it was a little bit earlier on.
When I was brain dead, that one. Okay.
Susie was just commenting that Iowa has the phase 3 concept.
Okay. So this is how you would establish that relationship between that unique identifier in Jackalope that would then point to a roads and highways attribute somewhere in some layer that will enable us to get the coordinates. Let's go back. So we've set up our primary key. And let me get a complicated one. I think county. Here's county. I think this one was complicated. I think in Nevada we have 7 or 8 Jackalope attributes being updated from roads and highways data. There's a couple different, there's a couple different types of information that you can have come over. The first are all scalar or just single value things, like we could copy an integer, a floating point, just a string. That's pretty much it. And those are just simple, route name. Okay, well, we're just copying the route name as it is from roads and highways into Jackalope, and we're seeing if they're different. Easy. In the county, this is more complicated because when you go to the site interface in Jackalope and you look at the county, you're not seeing our crazy long internal ID for that, the Oracle primary key for that. You're actually saying the county name, right? And so we have a domain lookup that's already set up in Jackalope to basically say, well, this county, or this column, excuse me, is actually an ID and it's using a domain lookup. When the user looks at county, he's not interested in seeing the ID, he wants a drop-down list of all the counties, and that's what they will check. So that is already set up, and that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle I will get to in a second. This is how you establish foreign keys. So again, the column source is not Jackalope, it's roads and highways. We're going to be pulling the information from the ArcGIS REST endpoint and not from Jackalope user entering in information. Unlike last time where the primary key was what we chose, we are choosing from ArcGIS layer. So this is a foreign key relationship. So again, we already have our coordinates because we queried the primary key, and now we're going to be querying this information to get the foreign key. Again, we've got 2 base URLs, and we picked one. We have a particular layer, and it's called statewide routes. And within statewide routes, we have multiple columns. And in this particular case, it's county code. And so Jackalope will go out there, it'll query a particular point that says, what county is this point in? And then information will come back. Now, unfortunately, what we discovered early on is the information that comes back is not exactly what we expected. We were expected, we have those domains I was just talking about early where Clark County refers to internal ID 1 billion. We were thinking this lookup would be the opposite, so that we would get something that says Clark County for roads and highways, and then we could easily look up, oh, Clark County is ID 1 million, which isn't the case, which we knew ultimately wouldn't work, but we thought it would be good enough for phase 1. So what we did is we created a new domain lookup, basically, that allows you to take the county information that comes from this layer, which is a 2-letter abbreviation in this case. So Washoe County is WA or something like that. We need to be able to look up what WA is and then compare that to the Jackalope domain lookup, which is Washoe County, and then finally come up with the ID. So there's like, again, this is super complicated, and there's not going to be a test. We will help you set this up. But the point is, the domains now work both directions. So you can have a Jackalope domain, and you can have a roads and highways domain. We also had to add the ability to change the spatial relationship. So when you query in roads and highways, you can query based on multiple different spatial relationships. So you could say, this point contains, or this area contains this point. That would be one thing. Or envelope intersection, or intersects means something else. What we had to do in Nevada is a lot of doing things like within 50 feet, because the Trina points that we're getting from that one system didn't exactly match the roads and highways points. There was a small disconnect there. So when we were trying to look up a route, which is a line, the point would just be slightly off that line. And so that wasn't good enough. So we added the ability to, do the kind of hand grenade approach of let's just get within 50 feet and that's good enough. And again, when it's done, you can either create a new site split or update existing site record. Currently, new site split's not implemented, it's just update new existing site record. And so that's how you establish your foreign key relationship. So again, primary key, go gets the point. And now that we've got our point, let's go query each of the foreign keys to get the information that we want. Okay, so that's how you set things up. Super simple. Under site admin, for those people that have this enabled, you'll see the roads and highways synchronization UI. And Chris, by the way, I cleared out your test data. I saved it if you want me to put it back, but just for the purposes of this demo, I wanted a clean slate. Stephen says, in our ADT research, 50 feet was sometimes not close enough. Please be careful. Most of the time, it's all right. Yeah. Yeah, that's going to be a configuration question for each of the states as we implement. Is 50 feet enough? Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I won't even get into that, but that's another ArcGIS issue we ran into in Nevada, which is some versions of some layers don't allow you to do the distance. You have to be exactly on. But luckily, the GIS people in Nevada were awesome, and they fixed that within like a day. So it was really good. Steven says, urban areas are sometimes tricky, parallel routes, etc. Yeah, that's a good point. So this will be, we can't just slap in parameters. We have to be a little bit smart about it and understand the GIS and what's happening. Because then we have the other problem. If you make it too wide, we might bring back more than one record. And then, we just arbitrarily pick, the first one. So, which I think might be the closest one, but I'm not sure. So here's the synchronization UI. And this is where you're going to see that staged information. So when we go out and we query roads and highways, it's going to come back with a list of things that are different. And here's where that list ends up. So let's just start a query real quickly. First of all, we're not going to do a full scan because a full scan takes a while. We're just going to scan things that begin with 011. All right, it won't take too long. It'll just take a minute. Steven says, companies can make a life out of inflation. Fair. I don't know that we will, but I know there are people out there that probably do. So first of all, I'll mention these same three controls. This is the same control that I was talking about in sitemap. It's just a little bit prettier because for some reason. But this is going to be the control that could potentially, well, that will eventually have like an advanced tab where you can go and construct your, I can't remember what you called it, Susie, but the query builder, that's what you said. So it's like a query builder where you can go and then you can save your queries. Eventually this control will be all of that. But currently it's just the simple, Saturday begins with this, or county is this. Okay, so it didn't take too long. I came back with our results. So down here in the actual grid, we can see some of the things that happened. Let me real quickly go over the different statuses that can come back, and there's 6. You can see them here. Updated means that the attribute in roads and highways, which in this case for site 011-001, the route name is IR80 East to whatever that is in roads and highways. In Jackalope, it is IR80. And so updated means that the value is different than what is in Jackalope. In roads and highways only means what you might think it means, which is that, like in this example, the ramp field is 4 in roads and highways and is blank in Jackalope. In these first two, only these first 2 cases can be synchronized. And I'll explain why in a second. So when you go down here and say synchronize selected or whatever, or synchronize all, it's only going to be updated and in roads and highways only rows that are going to be synchronized. Ignored means you've gone through the trouble and said, oh, I don't care that this route name is this. I don't want it to change in Jackalope. You would ignore that record, ignore selected, and it would essentially take it off the list now and in perpetuity. So every time it saw that it was different, it would check the ignore status of that row and say, oh, we've already ignored it, forget about it. And so you will no longer see this row when it comes time to update. To unignore it, you just make sure the ignored is being shown and just hit the unignore down below. Okay. In Jackalope only means that you have a value in Jackalope only. Let me just, I'm going to undo everything and because I don't want to search for these things. And if it's not obvious, you can change which fields are being shown by checking and unchecking these boxes. So currently we're only going to see in Jackalope only fields in this grid. So essentially, so site 011, 0013 has a functional class of minor collector in Jackalope. It doesn't have anything in roads and highways. So the default action is to not overwrite the Jackalope value with null in this case. The assumption is you probably don't want that. If that is something that people want, we may, that's something we'll probably have to make as a parameter or field specific. This particular field, the urban rural, for example, is can get overwritten with nulls. But the assumption is that if there's a null in roads and highways and there's not a null in Jackalope, you probably don't want that propagated. I know we're not going to have any flag, but we'll try it anyway. So flagged means, confused it. Flagged means that something weird happened. And the most common weirdness is going to be that the domains don't match up. So if in the Nevada roads and highways endpoint, remember the county, they have a 2-digit county code. If for whatever reason there's a county XX or something that we pull back, well, we've defined a domain for roads and highways in that metadata I was just talking about. If we can't get X to match up with one of those domains, that's a flag. That'll be flagged. And so if that happened, you would see that here, and you would be able to hover, and you'd be able to get the error, like what happened. We don't support, XX is not a valid domain in Jackalope for our county. And finally, currently there's no finalized, but a row is finalized after it's been synchronized. So if you have a updated row or roads and highways row, those will ultimately go to being finalized after we synchronize them. Okay. But I want to actually do that in a second, but first let me quickly explain the stuff over here. So when you do a new scan and you do a scan all, it's potentially limited by this filter. So if this checkbox says use filter when scanning, it's not really going to scan all. It's going to scan everything that matches this filter. That's why it only took, I don't know, 15 seconds. It didn't take very long at all to query all site IDs that begin with 011. This is really useful in testing because the full scan of all attributes for all, 10,000 sites or whatever takes a while. It takes, I think in Nevada here, it takes like an hour and a half maybe for the full scan. And so when you're testing, it's kind of useful to have this and make sure it's checked before you hit the scan now button. The since last run is what we were talking about before. This is only going to be possible for layers that support, time stamping, basically, the modified date or the creation date. When things were actually created, that's the only time we can do this sort of query. And that's in the phase 2, if you recall my slide area. And same with since. If you want to get all changes since a particular day, that would be something that's going to be in phase 2. The network as of date, that's the part where I said, oh, well, if you want to, some ArcGIS servers allow you to roll back the network to a particular date and see what its status is then. That's where this would come into play. And that's another phase 2 thing. Right now, we're always just looking at the current status of the network. Okay. I think that's it. So let's just go ahead and let's do something simple. Let's just synchronize this guy. Oops. First things first. Link. Sites. List. Link. We are going to be looking at the route. So for this site, well, this is a good example. So for this site, route is a naming convention, and it's composed of just one sub-naming convention, which is also called route. As you know, certain naming conventions, well, here's an example. That long as a naming convention here. So you can have more than one sub-naming convention that gets put into the actual naming convention. And so the naming convention itself here is composed of concatenating the sub-naming conventions based on rules that are set up in that same metadata screen that we were just in. The point I'm trying to make is we are only updating the sub-naming convention of route. We're not updating the actual full route name. So when we do the synchronization, we'll see this change from IR80 to IR80 with all those other letters. We'll also see this IR80 changed, just as an FYI. Let's see, IR80, ramp. All right, route. So let's just have that highlighted. We hit synchronize selected. It just takes a second. It's pretty quick. Let's go ahead and edit traffic site again. All right, so now you see our route change. Well, two things. You see our sub road naming convention changed to IR80 east to blah, 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 and also the full road name changed as well. So, and it was not a site split, it was a changes applied to the entire range kind of thing. And now when we go in here, you'll see the status is updated to finalized. So maybe you don't want to see those, maybe you just want those to go away as you're doing your thing. Let's see. Okay, this is a good one. Let's talk about ramps. And this is a domain thing here. Is this the same one? What site is this? Yeah, that's the same one. Cool. So let's do here. So in roads and highways, there is a ramp value of 4. In Jackalope, there is nothing. So let's go back to the site and let's look at ramp. Like you will notice, ramp is a domain and it has no 1, 2, 3, 4, anything. It's just yes, no. This is part of that domain thing I was talking about. So in Nevada, we created a view that based on certain ramp codes in roads and highways, we would either return a Y or an N. And those ramp codes are, an internal domain that they've set up, they each have their own meaning. We don't care about all those individual meanings. We only just care if it means it's a real live ramp or not. And so this will show you the domain translation. So when we go over here, and let's go ahead and just synchronize that. Link. Come back over here. We're going to edit again. So 4, I don't remember whether 4 means yes or no, but ramp is now yes. So 4 means yes. So this is a little bit of a confusing part. Let me go back and turn finalize back on because I wanted to show you. So for ramp, it would have been, it didn't say yes here, it just said 4. And it relies on the translation to know that 4 equals yes in Jackalope. So that's just a little complication that you might have to get used to there. I'm going to turn off finalized again. And yeah, that's true of all of these fields. We've basically covered all the complications. Most of the time, you'll probably just want to hit synchronize all if there are things that you want to synchronize. It doesn't take long to do that. Synchronizing is a pretty quick operation. And yeah, I think that's all I've got. And so does anybody have any questions?
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
This is
Tom?
Tom Reese. Yeah,
Yeah.
what's that? The site split capability, is that for all of the synchronization that will come later, or is there some of that is working now?
No site split stuff is currently implemented. Because there's a little bit of a complication is, if we implement site split, we need to know what date the site split occurs. And so we can make some assumptions. We could say, well, it's occurring on the date that they ran the synchronization, but that may not be true. You may not have done the synchronization for a while, or who knows what. So there's a bit of a design issue for site split, which is why it's not implemented, which is, okay, so you make a site change a month ago to change a site from 2 lanes in each direction to being 3 lanes in each direction. And you've since run data. We need to know that happened a month ago. Otherwise, we're not, when things bind, when data gets run into the system, we won't know whether to bind it to the 2-lane incarnation of the site or the 3-lane incarnation of the site. So that's kind of why the site split is on hold. We don't know what date to use. Does that make sense, Tom?
There's also a
one-
question in there from Christy.
I did just want to mention, not because one thing, is it Kentucky, Jeff? I can't remember. Maybe it's Larimer County. There's actually an as of date in the feature class itself. So when they go and change number of lanes from 2 to 2 to 3 and 3, they have to put a date in the layer that indicates when that should occur. And then we can use that. I know, Jeff, this is not part of roads and highways, is it? It's the highways by extra thing. We use that date as the site split date. And that's maybe a good way to do it. For things that you want site splitted, make yourself have that extra field in the layer that is the date that you want it to be done as of. Okay, Christy says, how far are we from testing this use case? Functional class change in LRS leads to a functional class change, factor group change, and a schedule group change in Jackalope. So functional class because, the functional class to functional class change, no problem, that can happen now. Factor group change, currently, if there's so basically it's all through domains. So if you set up your factor group site metadata, let's say, as a, oops, I didn't mean to do that, well, that's okay. If you set up your metadata for the factor group ID, seasonal factor group ID, you would set up that roads and highways domain. You would point to the functional class layer. You would pull back the functional class as long as you can reasonably define a view that for a given functional class, you could return a factor group ID, which, I don't remember what factor group names look like in Minnesota, but it seems like that would be possible. Then that's testable right now.
I think in Kentucky that is done. I think there's translation between functional class and factor groups, but then they don't use scheduler, so that's a whole now third tier.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're not talking about the Bentley in this setup, but
yeah, right. So we would just the where it is tricky is the scheduler change, unless that was a site change. Scheduler is not something that, so currently it's just updating one of those four. Well, that's not true, is it? I'll have to think about scheduler. But anyway, for the factor group, it would just be creating a view that we could put the view name into here that translates from the roads and highways functional class name to the correct Jackalope ID, which I think should totally be doable. That should be easy. And scheduler, I just need to think through that. And Christy, who's next? After Nevada, was it Nicholas or was it, who's the next guinea pig?
Utah is.
Okay. So we could set them up, and it does not, I'm hoping we've gotten through all the weird edge cases. We had a really, Nevada, there was just a lot of things that we didn't expect, and that's great. We fixed them all, and I think things are really stable and looking good right now. I honestly don't expect any other weird things. Famous last words. But so, in theory, setting up Utah, just won't take very long. And if you want to be one of the next guinea pigs, Minnesota, that's fine. Susie says, how does MnDOT currently handle that functional class use case, FC to factor group to schedule manually? Probably, yeah, I was going to say, probably all by hand. So yeah, I mean, we're looking good. We haven't done Utah yet just because prep for users group takes all of our focus, but you know, we can coordinate with Utah, come up with a time when we can do this, and then honestly, I think it's at that point just a configuration issue. We just, you know, and it doesn't take long. This looks complicated, but it really isn't that bad once you get used to it, and we're used to it. So Margaret says we just aren't really updating Jackalope in Idaho for class urban acceptance. Well, hopefully we can. I mean, because you're one of the people, Margaret, right? We have an exposed public endpoint now. Yep, that you sent me a while ago. So in theory, we can. All right.
So a loaded
That's-
question, which I don't even know the answer to, is is this just offered to anyone who has roads and highways? And we do the work to set it up as just part of a regular Jackalope maintenance and support contract?
Well, that is a loaded question. It's something we talked about at the beginning about money and stuff like that. But I think yeah, well, I would rather talk about that amongst them and us. I mean, we did talk
Like as
originally
a use by use?
process, and I think at the very least this falls into the RDI maintenance bump, but
Which is small. I mean, that's not even, it's a negligible.
this I think is far more easier to maintain than our normal RDI scripts.
There's one more question from Christy.
Yeah, I was just, how will users know the results indicating a change are not due to their events in the LRS being in the wrong place? I don't think we can know that. If you're talking about, so we query and we figure out the sequence number X is this coordinate, and then we go to the county layer, for example, and figure out which county encompasses that point. You know, I don't know that, unless I'm misunderstanding your question, I don't know how we would ever be able to tell that that was not, you know, that the county was not in the right place. Is that what you're asking, Christy?
No, it's more about if the source of where like a site record is located, is it all impacted by like LRS event behaviors? Or if it's strictly tied to the lat long stored within the site, and then how that lat long
I see.
is updated. So it's like more of like an order of operation of
Okay.
deal with your route changes, then run this tool.
So more specifically, so we are just looking, so in Minnesota, let's say you have sequence number 6-1s. We will query roads, and we are not looking at the lat long in Jackalope. That's not the key. We are querying the correct layer in your everything for a sequence number of 6-1s. And then we're getting that coordinate. So yeah, if people are willy-nilly changing the locations of your stations in roads and highways, we will be wrong because we're going to take that coordinate. We're not taking the coordinate in Jackalope.
Okay, so we just have to know if you're a internal event or an external event and how you first process the triggers from the LRS system to say, hey, your event might have been impacted by this route change. You would want to deal with that first before this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you really trusted your lat longs in sight, I mean, there's no reason we couldn't have a switch someday that says, well, instead of trusting the name, trust our lat longs that we have in Jackalope. And then we would use those coordinates as the primary key lookup to the other layers. I mean, again, that's technically possible. If that's a business possibility, I don't know. Oh, Susie said Drew will
Yep.
set up configuration testing time. Sounds good. Fingers crossed, Nicholas. I think it's just going to be, boom, we're done. And yeah, it might be useful also to have a relatively current version of everybody's database here, because we're going to be initially doing this on our dev environments, because you guys can't play with this until you get 7 anyway on your prods. But you can.
2 hours.
What's that? You can, but you can still access your production roads and highways database from our development instance of yours or test instance of yours. So that might be something we do just so it's kind of somewhat current, because who knows how old our Utah test database is and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say that everybody that we host, we know we've got current copies of that, but I think Utah has been a while. So if they are the next, then we should definitely get it on our radar to work with their Oracle person to get a copy.
Okay.
So Drew and Susie can work with me to find the right contact.
Sounds good.
All right.
One additional question, and I'm not sure if I can ask it the way I want to ask it, but I'm going to go ahead and try. So
Okay.
we have roads and highways, right? And we have stations, and we will get an LRS update notification saying, something on this route has had some sort of change. And there are times where our stations have disappeared due to that change, unintentionally, of course, but they disappear once we're reviewing them. Would these show up on this list, or how do we deal with that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this sort of is kind of shoehorns into what Christy was talking about too. So if you are, I don't know why you're losing that station. Is that because maybe it's because maybe that route got deleted or something? I'm not sure, but the chances are we wouldn't be able to recover from that. We would query roads and highways, and just like you're seeing the site missing, you would also see the site missing. And we'd throw up our hands at that point. There's nothing more we can do. But I also don't know exactly why those stations disappear. I don't know
Yeah,
if
I
the-
think sometimes it may just be either a rule that was set up and needed to be changed, and we just didn't reach that scenario until that point, or kind of like Margaret's saying in the chat box as well.
Okay. Yeah, Margaret said, occasionally it's because of realignment or because GIS used a different type of event that had unexpected behavior. Yeah, so one of those, it fell through the cracks because we didn't have that specific combination of events dealt with. And Christy says, event behavior is tied to the type of edit done to the roadway. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it fell through the cracks. Margaret says, at Christy, we have also managed to find just weird things that even had ESRI shaking their heads. All right. Software.
It's honestly best to find the least experienced LRS editor and just tell them to go do stuff. And you will find all of the unforeseen circumstances.
Gotcha.
Nicholas is offering a possibility of why he's
I
seen
like
that.
that one. Yeah, Nicholas says, when I see that, it means that the layer that existed was inundated and replaced. But my rules set up to it indate as well. Oh yeah, so the rules set up the thing to indate as well, yeah. But no rule is set up to create. It's waiting for my input on roads and highways next to recreate the route due to how the GIS editor made that change. Yeah, so you've got a rule. Yeah, so all through the cracks. The layer was indated or the indated and replaced, but the rules didn't do the same for the station.